Well, thank you, Madhukar, for inviting. I can't actually say I'm not an invitee because I am part and parcel of the Center for Learning Resources. I have been and I continue to be. So I don't consider myself an invitee. I don't consider myself a guest of any sort. But it was good to have the opportunity when you were planning the program to be able to come and meet and to be able to share some thoughts. Okay. So I think that I mean, it's a great honor, actually, that, to be able to address all of you today. And the one common factor here, of course, quite apart from all the concerns that Madhukar has been speaking about, very, very grave concerns, we are also, all of us, Bal Premi. And I think that that Bal Premi aspect is the most, that is where the hope lies, that everybody who is working in this field is absolutely for the child and child development, the child's further life in terms of the human capital of the country. Yes. So the focus is on the child, and when the focus is on the child, then it is fitting that this program has been organized in conjunction with the birth anniversary of Tarabai Modak. So all the grave concerns that Madhukar has mentioned, actually, if we really look at FLN even, okay, it is and he mentioned it, it is the child development continuum that has to be the undergirding of, and the child development continuum is actually from age 0 to 8, okay, and it is that continuum when the NEP was being formulated and civil society organizations were asked to give their inputs. We in the Alliance for the Right to Early Childhood Development, we put up this whole thing that you cannot talk about vibrant Anganwadis, you cannot talk about FLN, okay, unless you're taking into account the earliest levels and how without that early development, early cognitive development, early social emotional development, we cannot achieve the goals of literacy and numeracy. So with that, I think that it is fitting to then talk about Tarabai Modak, which is the brief I have been given, that after all, we are pegging the program on the anniversary of Tarabai Modak, and she was absolutely a giant in the field of early childhood education. So I'd like to talk, the title that I chose also was what is, in fact, her life and her enduring legacy. Now, it's a bit, there are many people here who are steeped in Tarabai Modak's philosophy. We have Mr. Panse here, we have Nilesh Nimkar, we have Manjari Nimkar, we have so many other people who would have studied her life and her contribution in depth, But when I was discussing this program with Madhukar the other day, we felt that it would still be fitting for those who are not as familiar to start with talking about her life, her contribution, and take it from there and really give a little bit of time thinking about what was in fact her contribution, okay? So with that, I think that the first thing I want, actually, as students of education, even in the DEd, I think there's a sort of a 15-mark answer, which is for Tarabai Modak, And I happened to go to the YouTube to look, it's always good to look for things, somebody speaking on Tarabai Modak. There are all these notes for how to give this 15-minute answer. And they're very superficial. very superficial. I mean, Tarabai Modak, you know, the kind of contribution and what was the inception at that time of that contribution doesn't seem to feature at all. And so I think that it is what I don't know whether teacher educators actually, besides what was her contribution in terms of the kind of programs she developed, or you know that she started the Nutan Bal Shikshan Sangh and so on and so forth, which all comes in that how to answer the paper, okay? But what was the historical context in which this work arose, and what were the intellectual influences on Tarabai Modak? I think it's important for students of education to understand that, and for all of us to understand that if we are saying that we base our work to a large extent in India in early childhood education at sort of a core of that initial work that was done by Tarabai Modak. Okay? So I'd like to touch upon those two elements, the historical context and the intellectual influences. Now, the intellectual influences, you just cannot talk about Tarabai Modak's work without talking about Maria Montessori. And I know that those of you who have actually studied and have lived, in fact, within the whole taking forward the work, as in the Nutan Bal Shikshan Sangh and so on, are of course familiar with all that. But I'd like to say that without what was the intellectual influence, that was definitely Maria Montessori. And let's talk about the historical context. So in the 1920s is when this Italian doctor, Maria Montessori, she had been doing her work with children in Italy, and her work was spreading. And I mean, I'm just cutting short a lot of the things, but the literature on her work was reaching India and many other nations at that time. And it caught the imagination of many Indians at that time that here was a method by which you could educate very young children. Okay. Now, the idea of ECE as a stage in education, that is not indigenous to India. It was not at that time. There were not schools for very young children. You know. So it was this, when this literature globally sort of exploded, that is when Indians who were running schools interested in young children came to the fore and took note of it. You know. And that is when some small schools started on the lines of what Maria Montessori's philosophy was. So what was this philosophy? What was this model? Very, in a sketch, I could say, because many of you are actually familiar, the whole concept of learning by doing, the whole concept of hands-on education. The children learn not through just listening and looking at a blackboard, but actually handling materials. That children can have freedom to explore, freedom to move around. That children develop confidence, independence, because of the pedagogy which allows for that kind of freedom and independence. So that was, in a nutshell, what the philosophy of Maria Montessori was. But in her case, she designed very specific materials, specially designed, through which children could learn concepts, through which children's minds could develop. And she, when it reached India, actually it was quite an elitist education. It was mainly the people who initially took it up were people who were running small schools that were attended mainly by well-to-do children from well-to-do families. You know, the Theosophical Society, they were running some schools. Even teacher training courses had started. And then there was a principal amongst those was Gijubai Badekar, who actually moved away from Gijubai Badekar, an educator from Gujarat, Bhavnagar in Gujarat. He was running already a Bal Mandir, which a small school, but he was the one who initially took forward the idea that this could be adapted for a diverse group of children by caste, by religion, and also in terms of socioeconomically, poor children, the poorer children. Okay? And that's when Tarabai Modak, she resigned as a college principal, actually, in Mumbai, and joined Gijubai. And they worked together. Ultimately, it culminated, their work that worked together culminated in the establishment of the Nutan Bal Shikshan Sangh. And many of you may, of course, be members. Even now, the Nutan Bal Shikshan Sangh is quite operative. And then there are people here like Nilesh and Mr. Panse and many others here who have actually also grown up within that whole tradition, you know, of an adapted Montessori, catering to children from Dalit communities, Adivasi communities, and those very, very specifically designed, expensive Montessori materials. Tarabai Modak very creatively adapted to village life in India, rural life in India. You may know of the Bordi experiment, and then of course there was Kosbad, and there are some interesting anecdotes. You see, Maria Montessori herself was not for any kind of adaptation. You know, she just actually did not want any adaptation. She actually saw it as a sort of intellectual copyright of her method, you know. And here was Tarabai Modak not looking back after a certain time, you know, they were going ahead. But once when Gijubai had some friends visiting Europe, and they were going to be meeting Montessori, and he said, do tell her about this wonderful work we're doing, which is really based on your philosophy and your work. So the friend did, in fact, try to do that and brought back the message that she was greatly displeased. I mean, she just wanted no such adaptation, you know. And at that time, the real significance of this work was because it was a nation-building objective. It was not just, you know, schools for children, and it was the early creation of citizens and building a cohesive nation, a new nation, because the independence struggle was on. And Gandhiji happened to meet Montessori also in London. He visited Montessori schools and was very taken by this method and felt that this was the method for India, for ECE in India. But nobody could call the adapted version Montessori because she was not for that, you know. So Gandhiji actually wrote to her and said, look, you come and do the adaptation, do it for us, you know, and because we need your method and your philosophy. And I should actually quote what she wrote back, okay? She wrote back to Gandhiji. Just give me a moment. She wrote back, I am not a tailor. I have produced the cloth. If you want to wear it in a special way in India, it is for your teachers to cut it according to your taste. Okay? And she refused to participate in any cultural adaptation of her method. And for Tarabai Modak, there was no looking back. She was free to then carry on. As long as it was not called Montessori, there was no problem to actually adapt it and creatively adapt it also. And this was really her far-reaching contribution, adapting it and creating a competing frame to the orthodox Montessori, expensive orthodox Montessori. But of course, there was an elitist tradition. Even now, in fact, it has picked up even more now in many countries, Montessori schools, which are becoming more and more popular. And there are many, many good things about the philosophy itself and the pedagogy. But this contribution of bringing it to our villages and our cultural context, and also uniting children from diverse backgrounds, this is a really lasting legacy of her work. And it remains for all of those of us over here who have worked with the core of that legacy. Okay, it does. We know that the core is Montessori, but people have then adapted, improvised, and developed further on that core. And so when we talk about her enduring legacy, I think for me, there are two other aspects to it besides the programs itself, besides the philosophy, besides the pedagogy. Okay? One of them is that for any educationist working at any time, there is a need that whatever the model may be, it is firmly rooted in an underpinning of a theory that one believes in or that one is passionate about. And a lot of times that gets left out. And this is what she did. I mean, she believed and she went for it, so to speak. And there is a very firm theoretical understanding. There may have been sticks and stones and shells and Jivan Vihar and all, but underlying it, there was a cohesive philosophy. And I think that is a legacy that we all have to take into account. And another legacy is that she did not just stick with the received orthodox wisdom. She used a certain underpinning to move on and to create according to, at that time, nation-building needs. And I think this is the legacy that I felt that for CLR, when we founded the CLR in the 80s, I felt that we certainly at that time, this was early 1980s when my husband and I founded the Center for Learning Resources, the dominant model was definitely Tarabai Modak's. That was the model. We must have visited, I don't know, in order to, before starting something like this, before saying that we can be a technical support organization, people can knock at our doors and get good academic support and training support, materials and so on for improving the quality of programs. Okay? But before you could do that, especially like if you had been yourself not done your initial training and so on through the same thing of Tarabai Modak's philosophy, etc. It was very important to learn. And that learning had to take place before we could actually sort of throw open the doors to institutions and collaborate and offer such services. And we were fortunate when my husband was when we first came back from the States, my husband was on the faculty of Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and the whole library was open to me to be able to really look into whatever and at that time in Bombay, also associated with Mobile Creche Bombay. So those were some very, very good centers, and I was in and out of those. And then there was Dr. Meenakshitai Apte, who was on the faculty there. And she became a great friend, and she was a great source of inspiration. She was heading the Family and Child Welfare Department at that time. And we even thought, she said, why don't we start a Balwadi for the staff of the Tata Institute, children of the staff, and not the faculty, but the other support staff, you know. And she looked into it, but ultimately it didn't come through. But I was very excited. I thought that would be a great thing to do, particularly in cooperation with her. But then we had decided that we were going to try and start this center. And we had zeroed in on Pune. And Meenakshitai was in touch, of course, with Achyut Rao Apte, who was at that time heading this investment in man, and in about a 50-mile radius of Pune were these Balwadis. And I think it was Nirmalatai Purandare who had set up these Balwadis for investment in man. And they were actually, there was wonderful work going on there. But at the same time, so we visited, and we were, you know, again, in and out, to try to understand what exactly was the model that was being followed, because they wanted to see where the improvements could also come. And at that time, this legacy that I talk about, that you don't only rely on a received orthodox wisdom, but you can create. And I felt that it was important by the 1980s to be able to look into I was already had studied it, and I felt that what about the application of the work of two other theorists? One was Jean Piaget, and one was Vygotsky. Okay? And what was the part about their philosophy, actually, their contributions, both psychologists, that could augment the work that Nirmalatai was doing, where the model was definitely Tarabai, Modak, and the Montessori model. Okay? What could augment it? One was to bring a very strong focus to the reasoning abilities of children. Another was to bring a greater focus to the language development and its relationship to cognition. Okay. That was needed. And also, of course, the continuation of working with the poorest children. You know, how do you apply all this? And how do you convey it to our teachers without a whole lot of terminology and all the conceptual kind of terms and so on? How do you do that? And that was the challenge at that time. And we developed, therefore, another frame, okay? At the core, I would say, pride of place was Montessori, was Tarabai Modak, okay? But at the same time, we added components and we added insights. And so we had a frame whereby we besides creative activities and free play and so on, we had 5 areas. One was the largest area was thinking things out, we called it. Vichar karu lagtana. Okay. Another was developing spoken language and its relationship to thinking things out. Another was a clear focus on school readiness, but entirely play-based, but definitely there in terms of early school readiness, and school readiness in a much broader sense than only teaching the alphabet and number and so on. Okay? But in order to do that, we had getting ready to read and write, and we had beginning to count and calculate. And we tried and we had environmental learning. And this formed a model, a slightly different model curriculum, which is still at the base of CLR's work in early childhood education. It continues as a base. Now, going back to Tarabai's legacy, and we, as I said, for many of us here, the core does remain that, But there are, I think now, what was her other legacy in terms of the nation itself was, of course, that ICDS, Integrated Child Development Scheme, that was actually adopted. Tarabai's model of adapted Montessori was adopted by ICDS. But of course, we are also familiar that there were many pockets in which there was wonderful Anganwadis, and implementing them well. There were civil society organizations, NGOs, who were giving support to Anganwadi, and still are, and wonderful things happening. But by and large, ICDS does continue to face many challenges. Then all the official documents, that's another legacy. All the other official documents, take NEP, take Nipun Bharat, anything. Learning by doing, hands-on education, that aspect of the philosophy continues. And adapt to a low-cost model, that continues. Okay. But actually, now in the implementation, and Madhukar spoke a lot about FLN, unless we're going to look at the continuum, and we're going to start with those 3-year-olds, and for CLR, you start with birth to 3, as he announced also. But unless you start there, we will not be able to achieve the FLN goals. Okay? And when you're starting there, what are some challenges? What are some dangers? I'd like to just touch upon that. One of them is that we'll have to think about is how much of a kind of much more formal learning will start earlier. The continuum, actually, as I said, we were involved in discussions at the NEP level. It was to say FLN can be based on the ECCE continuum. Objective being that it was the ECCE pedagogy that goes upward to class 1, 2, and 3, and not the other way round. But we have to be careful. These Balvatikas that have been proposed, then there's, and also the grave, there is an urgency for literacy and numeracy, but how is it going to be done? It's not whether it should be done, but how is it going to be done? There's a whole pressure of a competing of low-cost private schools giving workbook-based early childhood education to children. There's that whole challenge, okay? Is this hands-on education, freedom to learn, is that going to continue? There's also an understanding. I've seen more and more now when I've been visiting, an understanding of very school readiness being seen in a much narrower light. going straight to the skills of alphabet and number and so on, and not all the other dispositions that children need in order to learn effectively in classes 1, 2, and 3. And that disposition for learning, that needs to be created right from early childhood, right from the 3 and 4-year-olds. And that has been CLR's, one of the things that we talk about a lot, these dispositions of learning, besides the actual skills of literacy and numeracy. So with that, taking these challenges, thinking about them, what is going to happen to Tarabai Modak's vision? And friends, let's rise to the occasion and see that it flourishes. Thank you.
Thank you for your valuable thoughts of Tarabai. की ताराबाईंचं कार्य हे केवळ 15 ते 20 मार्कांसाठी नाही आहे, तर त्या बालशिक्षणाची पाळंमुळं ही 100 वर्षांपासून रुजलेली आहेत आणि त्या सगळ्यामध्ये ताराबाईंचं योगदान हे मोठं आहे आणि येणाऱ्या अनेक वर्षांसाठी त्या सगळ्या विचारांमधून, त्या प्रयोगांमधून दिशा मिळणार आहे. नाऊ I would like to invite Ratif Hopes, Governing Council Member of CLR and Director of LFE, to offer a small token of appreciation to Zakia ma'am.